So we've spent a lot of time in this course learning about the basic science of behavior, a way of understanding the ways in which environmental variables influence our choices and affect what we do. We've learned a lot about laboratory research because that's how we really narrow in on the causes of behavior, on demonstrating causality rather than just correlations. It's how we come to understand the actual mechanisms driving our behavior. But when we're hearing about a bunch of studies on animals demonstrating these basic principles, it's easy to forget that those same concepts and all these terms we've learned, those things apply to our own everyday behaviors, day by day, minute by minute. We've seen a lot of applications along the way, but for these next couple videos, I wanted to really dive into one specific real-world application so you can see an example of how all the ideas we've learned about are really relevant to what's going on when you get up in the morning, when you procrastinate from your assignments, when you make some small purchase, or when you interact with a friend's social media post. So we're going to talk about smartphones and social media and other kind of technology related stuff from a behavior analysis perspective. Now, there's a common saying among smokers, when you smoke, you always have something to do. So find yourself restless and needing to do something, smoke. Find yourself bored, light up a cigarette, right? Well, I'd say we can apply the same idea to most of us. When you have a smartphone, you could say, you always have something to do. Find yourself restless and needing something to do, grab your phone, right? Waiting for the last minute and a half on the microwave, check your notifications. Find yourself bored when you're mindlessly watching TV, click to open a mindless game app, right? Stressed about school or work or your relationship troubles, it's easy to browse YouTube or scroll social media on your phone. I sometimes imagine what an alien would think if it watched a modern human just chilling at home on a dull Saturday. Like watching the way we watch zoo animals and just observing the behaviors, right? Doing behavior analysis. They'd see us staring at this little thing in our hands and pecking at it with our thumb over and over and over. They'd see these human creatures pecking at this thing as they eat, pecking at this thing as they sit on the couch with their mating partner, pecking at it as they lay in their sleeping nest in the evening, even pecking at the device while they defecate and urinate. They might begin to see us the way we see Skinner's pigeons. They're sitting there pecking away at a blue-colored key inside an operant chamber. And indeed, Skinner found that simply by changing the rate of reinforcement, the rate provided by the environment, he could influence pigeons to peck hundreds or even thousands of times an hour. In one study, he manipulated the rate of reinforcement by thinning it out over time to the point his pigeons would peck something like 10,000 times just to get a single pellet of food reinforcement. That's not something a pigeon would naturally do, right? But pigeon brains, like human brains, are capable of learning, which means they're capable of being affected by environmental contingencies of reinforcement, which means they can end up doing some crazy ass shit, behaviorally speaking, given the right experiences. Well, as humans, we're not that different. Some early estimates actually found that people on average get on their phones every 15 minutes or less, on average. About 85 to 150 times a day. You'll hear different numbers depending on the study, and averaging around 3 to 5 hours a day, with the numbers being higher in some studies for younger people. And each of those times we get on that phone involves a lot of pecks, right? A lot of pecking behavior. So let's try to better understand some of this pecking behavior we do on our phones and on things like social media. Now, that said, just a side note, we are not going to address whether to call this something like smartphone addiction or whatever, right? Using the term addiction. The nosology, the defining of what counts as a disorder or disease and what to label addiction or not, that's really complex. And it's important. It's worth discussing in a course on disorders, but that debate isn't really central to our purposes here. It doesn't matter for us whether someone can be quote unquote addicted to a smartphone or social media. What we will address are things like, what can behavior analysis tell us about our use of smartphones and other technology as a behavior? And to understand what, reinforces and maintains those behaviors without worrying about the labels. We just want to understand why things happen, and how changes in the environment change our behavior. Now, if you are curious about the addiction terminology debate, you can find plenty of stuff online. So the psychologist Von Bell, he's a really great writer. He had a thoughtful write-up in Slate back in 2009, which I've kind of previewed on the right side here. And then the two citations I'm showing here, they also go into some of the debate, but in the peer-reviewed literature. So we're all familiar with addictions involving psychoactive substances, right, like alcohol or heroin, but there are also pathological conditions like compulsive gambling, which is often described as a behavioral addiction rather than a substance addiction, and it's actually classified in the DSM-5 as gambling disorder. So it makes sense that people would at least explore the idea of other behavioral addictions like sex addiction or whatever, of using the label addiction for things not involving an exogenous drug substance, right? That does make some sense. But again, that debate isn't what we're here to do. Rather, I think such debates can be informed by a better understanding of the learning related underpinnings of those relevant behaviors. So that's what we're going to focus on. We're going to focus on the behaviors, why we do what we do, even when it sometimes verges on problematic or unwanted behaviors, or even just things like procrastinating so much on our technology that we don't accomplish our goals, turn things in on time, or we just end up increasing our own anxiety and stress with these things. So let's talk about that. Well, to start, I want to flash back. I'm going to do this throughout this video. Flash back to earlier in the course. Like, we learned at one point about schedules of reinforcement, right? And we learned 4 of the most basic schedules and saw how simply being in that type of situation had a predictable influence on our behavior. Whether we're a rat or a pigeon or a human, a different type of schedule of reinforcement influences our behavior in a different way. We're under control of the schedule in some way. So we saw that the 2 ratio schedules, the fixed ratio and variable ratio, right, FR and VR, they had the highest rates of behavior overall. And then we also saw that the variable style of schedules, the ones that are really unpredictable in some way, like VR and VI, those are pretty good at resisting extinction. So those behaviors stick around even when reinforcement is thinned out or inconsistent, right? So thus, variable ratio, VR schedules, tend to have the highest rate of behavior and also resist extinction well. And at the time, we talked about VR schedules being used for slot machine programming because of this, right? The behavior of the slot machine player is controlled by the programming of the machine, by the environment. And boy, does this work. According to a CBS report, there are twice as many slot machines as ATMs in the United States. And slot machines make more money than all movies, all baseball, and all theme parks combined. Now, VR schedules, they produce a high and steady rate of behavior, which is good for the casino, but not necessarily good for the player, right? Who may feel like she's in control of her own choices, but in fact, we know her behavior is being influenced by the programming of the machine. So how does this idea apply outside of a casino? Well, let's start with the case study of pre-smartphone or early smartphone technology. Before there were push notifications, before there were notifications that popped up on your screen or played a tone to alert you to things, people only knew they had an email by logging into the email service or opening the email app and seeing if there was something there. And what happened at the time was lots of people, they would log in literally minutes after they had just checked and found an empty inbox. Because sometimes when they opened it up, they had an email. And this was in the day before email inboxes were, quite so full of spam and bullshit. So they were getting this intermittent and unpredictable reinforcement. In this case, kind of a VI schedule, right? Which we know leads to a moderate but steady rate of behavior overall. People were at the time writing blog posts about email addiction and how they couldn't believe they kept finding themselves logging into their empty email inbox over and over so many times per hour. Like, I just checked it and 10 minutes later, I found myself logging back in and there was no email, but then 10 minutes later, I checked again and then finally there was an email, right? That was a behavior people were complaining about. A lot of us were getting trapped in that loop, And so in 2003, BlackBerry came up with an idea, right? This is a company that made kind of early smartphones. They added email pushes to their phones. And ironically, at the time, they did this to fix an addiction-like behavioral loop that people were finding themselves trapped in. They initially did this as a way to help people. Why? Because with push notifications, you only check your email when the environmental cue shows up. So no more of this mindlessly kind of checking addictively just in case there's something there, right? So in our terminology, what they'd created was a nice simple contingency. The notification is a discriminative stimulus. It sets the occasion for our email opening behavior, because it tells us that now, and only now, is when opening the email will lead to reinforcement of new information or interactions. So this is good. We've created discrimination where the behavior only shows up in the proper context when we want it, not all the time and uncontrolled. It was a fix. But as the Batman quote goes, you either die a hero or you live long enough to see yourself become the villain. And by 2009, push notifications started to go down the villain path. That's when the company Apple, a couple of years after their first iPhone launch, started using push notifications for general apps, not just email. A year later, Android was doing the same thing on their phones. So now we've got push notifications used to interrupt us constantly and to pull our attention to their app, whatever app it is, and thus to their ads or whatever their way of getting money from us is. And if you're not careful to disable or control these notifications, you can end up with pretty much non-stop push notifications for all sorts of crap. And you may think you're immune to advertising, right? But we know that's not true. And the companies, they spend tons of money studying this very things. They know that's not true. They know the right triggers to get us to subtly alter our behavior, to subtly change the probability that we'll click something open and then end up spending a little more time in their app or website than we would have intended if you just asked us prior to that random message showing up on our notifications. Now, companies actually take advantage of the power of intermittent reinforcement and discrimination like this to control what behaviors we do. Think of R, right, the behavior, as like opening an app or a website. That's a behavior. Well, back before Facebook had a phone app, users would get notifications by email. So it'd be telling them so-and-so has updated his status or so-and-so has posted a new picture. But why, oh why, did the email not include the freaking status or the photo? That's so annoying, right? You have to click through and go into Facebook and log in to see that information from your friend or your colleague or your ex who you want to spy on. But now you're kind of curious, right? You got that notification, something's going on, but you can't see it. You have to click through, right? You have to go to their site. And what's your conscious intention when you do so? Your conscious intention is to see the status or to see the picture. But what do you end up doing? You scroll. You clear all your notifications. Soon you may find that you've spent 20 minutes on Facebook when you had intended to only spend a few seconds looking at this one thing. All because they deliberately designed that notification system to get you into their site or app, to get your eyeballs passing across more of their ads, and to maybe get you trapped by some of their other behavioral contingencies then. And again, in our terminology, what we've got here is a discriminative stimulus in the form of a vague notification telling us that if we open the app, we've got now a variable ratio chance of some social reinforcement, right? So when you open the app, there's a chance you'll get something interesting. To get that hit of reinforcement, you have to do a behavior, open the app. But once we do that, we can be trapped in other behavioral loops that they've set up, like infinite scrolling or other design tricks. And we know that contingencies involving variable ratio reinforcement are going to, over time, they're going to lead to a pretty high and steady rate of behavior, which is what these companies want, right? It increases the probability that you'll do that behavior, like opening their app, the next time you're in this situation with this discriminative stimulus. So the SD, it exerts stimulus control. It controls your behavior, which is why when you are bored and you open your phone to the home screen, you may find your thumb landing on a commonly used app before you even consciously think about whether you really wanted or intended to open that app. Your past history of reinforcement is opening that app for you. And once we're in the app, like in a social media feed, there is so much conditioning going on. So posting a selfie, it's kind of like playing a slot machine, right? Each time you check the photo to see how many likes you've gotten, it's this kind of unpredictable hit of reinforcement, which makes you both more likely to post pictures on their platform again, but also more likely to log in and check the state of things, to check the likes and the comments. And a similar idea is behind clearing out those notification counters you see, right? It's a behavior to check and clear those notifications. To the point, some people feel like a pretty serious pull to clear out that out if there's a number on something, right? They want to get it back down to empty. But that behavior is not necessarily something you sat down one day and deliberately decided, yeah, this is how I want to spend the limited hours of my life, clearing notifications forever. I always try and keep it at zero. No, the behavior has been influenced by the contingencies and the reinforcement schedules involved in what you do. And we could get trapped by such contingencies, even if the programmers didn't have any ill intentions at all. It can happen to us just as an unintended side effect. Except that companies do, in fact, have ulterior motives in how they design their user interface. Like, they have very well-paid UX researchers and UI designers, so user experience researchers and user interface designers, and people trained in behavior analysis who use their knowledge to control our behavior. That's their whole job, and they get paid very well for it. That's why tech stocks do pretty well. Even down to the color choices in the interface, designing every little detail in a way that their Skinner box-like testing has shown will maximize your pecs. So let's see some other examples of these dark patterns in design. A while back, there's this psychologist named Brian Wansink. He published a study where they used trick bowls that were secretly bottomless because they were secretly, quietly refilled without the participant knowing. So in the study, they were studying eating behavior. And they reported that when people ate out of a bottomless bowl, they ate 73% more and underestimated their calories quite a bit. So the environment, the bowl design, controls our eating behavior more than we realize, as well as our judgment and perception about our eating behavior. Now, just FYI, it turns out that Wansink, maybe not such a good scientist, he committed some scientific misconduct. A lot of his papers got retracted from the scientific record, and the guy resigned in disgrace. But we do have lots of reliable replicated research that does show our eating behavior is manipulated and controlled by variables like the size of our proportions and the size of the plate we're eating from. So that basic idea is actually correct. The reason I mentioned the bottomless bowl idea is just so you can see what's going on in a similar design choice on many websites and apps now. So swiping or scrolling on an app or a website, that's a behavior, right? That's an R. And if you think about it, for most things on our phone or social media where we're swiping or scrolling, we've got an unpredictable payoff. We've got a variable ratio setup where R might lead to a reinforcing stimulus. Sometimes, but not always, right? Sometimes it's boring or repetitive, like yet another picture of yet another generic baby of some acquaintance on Facebook. But other times it's juicy gossip or a hilarious gif or a political post that angers you enough to reply and just, maybe even just keep reading and interacting, engaging, or a cute cat video, right? Or any number of things that keep you scrolling, that keep you looking through one post after another, that keep you checking the stories of your friends and mutuals. Like scrolling on Instagram, if you think about it, that's kind of like re-pulling the slot machine lever to see what comes next. Sometimes it's great, sometimes it's boring, sometimes it's an ad. Keep pulling to see what comes next. Likewise, when you're swiping right on Tinder or Bumble or Hinge or whatever, it's playing a slot machine to see if you get a match, to see if you get reinforcement, right? And what we know from lots of user research is that pagination type of designs, where it's like, oh, page 1 is ended, I have to click to go to page 2, where you have to actively click to proceed to the next page, those interrupt that process. They provide an exit point. They make people less likely to keep scrolling forever. But designs like infinite scroll, where the web page or the app, it just keeps loading new content as long as you keep scrolling, that actually leads to people spending an hour browsing Reddit or Insta accidentally. If you ask people beforehand if they plan or desire to spend one of that day's waking hours browsing, they'd say, no, I don't. But our environment influences our behavior. Your intentions matter a lot less than you think. Imagine if a notification on one of these notifications actually told you what you were signing up for when you clicked on it. When you clicked, because, I'm just going to clear this notification real quick, when in reality, you're actually signing up for 20 minutes of browsing and swiping and scrolling. What if that button was honest about that? This whole idea that they just want to get you onto their site, right? They give you this vague notification to get you onto their site. It's really just an age-old sales trick repackaged in the digital era. It's the foot in the door technique. So in sales, foot in the door is a compliance trick to get people to agree to a big request or to a big purchase by first just getting them to do this little thing. You think that clicking that notification is committing to look at one picture for 30 seconds of your time, but really you're signing up for a lot more than that once they've got you in. Now, remember back to when we talked about intermittent reinforcement. We discovered that partial reinforcement effect, where behavior really sticks around more and is harder to extinguish when it's been reinforced intermittently, unpredictably, rather than every time you do the behavior. So the laboratory data in rats and pigeons and all of us humans consistently shows that variable ratio schedules are less susceptible to extinction. So the behavior is more long-lasting, it's harder to stop, even when the reinforcement schedule thins out. Like, if you look at the right half of this chart here, where it's labeled extinction at the top, notice how when we stop reinforcing an operant behavior, that's what extinction is, the behavior rate doesn't actually taper off and flatten out very quickly on those two variable schedules compared to the more predictable fixed schedules where it flattens out quicker, right? So how is this relevant? Well, when Facebook started, it didn't have any ads in the news feed. I mean, initially, it didn't even have a news feed, right? You had to manually check your friends' walls the same way people used to have to manually log into their email account to see if they had any emails. But Facebook added ads, right? They didn't have ads for a long time, but when they added them, they added a small amount of ads. Then they added a bit more. Then a bit more. And now it's a significant chunk of what you see. Likewise with Instagram and other apps and sites. The reinforcement rate, the things you want to see, it gets thinned out. But extinction doesn't kick in because there's still just enough reinforcement, all thanks to the power of a variable ratio schedule. And specifically to what we would call a progressive ratio, right? Where you keep increasing how many behaviors the person does between the reinforcements they get. You thin things out. That's how Skinner got his pigeons pecking 10,000 freaking times for a single food pellet. You don't start that way. You start with a higher rate of reinforcement for people, then you thin it out slowly over time, kind of evolving and controlling the behavior as you go. But let's step back for a minute from design choices made by companies that have a monetary interest in controlling your behavior. Let's just look at how our behaviors might end up in some unhealthy loops, even without anyone else involved. So I want you to consider for a moment that our own internal states, like emotions and feelings, these can be discriminative stimuli. Like, I'm feeling hungry right now. That's an SD that sets the occasion for my eating behavior to be really reinforcing right now. Or I'm feeling sad right now. That's an SD that sets the occasion for me to eat a bunch of ice cream and cry right now, making those behaviors more likely in the moment because this is when those behaviors will be really reinforcing. Well, let's analyze that idea in terms of what we've learned about negative reinforcement, about things like escape behaviors and avoidance behaviors. What do you do sometimes when you're feeling bored or anxious or whatever? When you're feeling bored, do you ever open up your phone, maybe even a little mindlessly, and click into Facebook or Snapchat or YouTube or TikTok? Why might you do that behavior? Well, as Skinner always reminds us, it's probably due to your past history of reinforcement. That's what controls our behaviors. I'll never know how many people liked my photo until I do the app opening behavior, R, and sometimes it pays off. Right? That's a nice intermittent reinforcement. I don't know if I'll see something funny or mind-blowing or angering on TikTok or YouTube until I click in and start watching stuff. But when I do the behavior of opening it up, I get some intermittent reinforcement, just like last time I did so when I was bored, and the time before that when I did so when I was bored. Based on what we know about reinforcement, that means the next time I'm bored, that app opening behavior is more likely because of that history of reinforcement after doing the behavior last time. So the key insight here is that internal states like boredom or anxiety or whatever, those can become a discriminative stimulus, a trigger or a cue that sets the occasion for app opening behavior all on its own. No notification needed from the company. Forget the big companies triggering your behavior. Your own internal feelings can do so. And the side effect is that it programs you to do that behavior even more in the future. So think back to when we learned about negative reinforcement, where a behavior is reinforced, it becomes more likely because doing it removes an aversive stimulus. It gets rid of a bad thing in the moment. That's an escape behavior. The escape behavior works, so we do it more and more and more in the future. It's the classic version of negative reinforcement. Well, internal states like anxiety and boredom and sadness and whatever, those can be temporarily removed by an app or a game on your phone, right? The app opening behavior removes the bad feeling temporarily, so you've escaped. It's an escape behavior to open it up. And we know that means negative reinforcement of the escape behavior is going to occur. It's becoming more likely in the future. The behavior of opening the app becomes more likely. It becomes reinforced for next time. So when you're anxious or bored, you're getting positive reinforcement for the app opening behavior, just in terms of, feeling good when you see something fun or funny or sexy or interesting, the stimuli you get in that app. That's positive reinforcement, sure, but you're also getting negative reinforcement because it's functioning as an escape from those inner feelings you were having. So it's a double whammy of reinforcement for app opening behavior. And remember, behaviors get reinforced relative to the context that was happening before the behavior and reinforcement occurred. So we're making that app opening behavior more likely in the future, specifically in that context, meaning the next time I'm anxious or bored. So the feeling sets the occasion for the behavior, which means it makes the app or game using behavior more likely every future time that you're anxious or bored. The feeling is the discriminative stimulus that's gained stimulus control. It influences your behavior because in the past, that's what's removed the feeling. The behavior has removed that bad feeling. So exactly what we would expect based on what we know from negative reinforcement studies done on rats and pigeons and humans in the laboratory. But now it's playing out 30 times a day in your own home, in your own hand, and it explains why you may check your phone or open a mindless game or scroll a social media feed much more often than you might consciously intend to do when you wake up at the start of that day. And in fact, social media and app design companies are very aware of these negative reinforcement contingencies based on your feelings and emotions. Indeed, Facebook has repeatedly gotten bad press when people found out that they are monitoring our emotions, and in some internal research studies, they've even manipulated people's emotions using A/B testing to see how our usage behaviors change when they secretly change our emotions by subtly manipulating what comes up in our news feed. So in one story, we actually found out that Facebook was tracking when teenagers were feeling insecure or worthless, and then used that to target ads to them so someone could make money off their feelings of worthlessness. Good luck, teenagers. But let's keep going with some other dark patterns of design that play off of behavioral conditioning principles. So speaking of infinite scrolls, YouTube and Netflix didn't used to autoplay the next episode or video, but now that's kind of the default unless you opt out or actively click stop. Some, websites don't even let you opt out anymore. This is a conscious design choice, and it's there for a reason. If YouTube just went silent and stopped at the end of whatever video you were watching, then you're more likely to close that browser tab or change to a different app or go do something away from the screen. But if they just start autoplaying something that their amazingly powerful algorithms have determined is something you'll likely be interested in, well, there's a decent chance they can keep your eyeballs on the screen longer than you originally intended, which means a decent chance of a bit more ad revenue for them. And you may not even realize your behavior has been changed from what you would have chosen otherwise. So let's connect this to a term we learned at the very start of this course, the idea of motivational operations, things that make a reinforcer more or less effective and thus increase or decrease the behavior when they show up. Like if you turn someone off with a really disgusting image, that's an abolishing operation, then sexy time behavior is going to be less reinforcing compared to if you turn someone on first with some seductive teasing and flirting. That's an establishing operation that makes the subsequent sexual behaviors more reinforcing. That's motivational operations. Or letting yourself get genuinely hungry as an establishing operation is going to make the behavior of eating something that much more reinforcing. But getting super full first, like you're just like, oh my God, I have a food baby, I'm so full. That's going to make the behavior of eating a delicious dessert not very reinforcing, right? That's an abolishing operation. So those were the ideas of motivational operations that we talked about. So other factors come into play whether people will do a behavior you want them to do. Like one strategy a company or salesperson or app designer could use is just to up the motivation with an establishing operation. Like you can make someone feel insecure and they're more likely to find your entertaining game app reinforcing for their scrolling behavior. Or alternatively, you can reduce the level of difficulty, making it easier to get the reinforcer. That's where autoplay comes in, right? It makes it so easy because it's automatic. You're taking a barrier away. So when motivation is high enough or the task is easy enough, the trigger, the discriminative stimulus is even more likely to cause the behavior. So there are factors outside of the reinforcement itself which dictate the probability of a discriminative stimulus setting the occasion for a behavior, of stimulus controlling your behavior. Those who work in design, they have a term for this. It's put hot triggers in the path of motivated people. It actually comes from this guy, B.J. Fogg, who's a behavioral scientist at Stanford. He founded the Persuasive Technology Lab. A lot of the founders and executives at big tech companies like Google and Pinterest and YouTube and Facebook, like the people who designed the monetization schemes of these sites and developed some of the high-level policy early on, they went through his classes or his lab. The documentary from 2020 called The Social Dilemma actually has interviews with a lot of these people, but this is the stuff that people working in the design field have known about and used for a couple of decades now. But let's finish out this video with one last case study of behavioral principles being used in tech design to manipulate us, this time in mobile gaming. So remember way back when we learned about respondent conditioning, stuff like Pavlov and his dogs, right? And we learned at the time about higher order conditioning. Basically, once Pavlov had his dogs drooling for the sound of a metronome, we can pair up the metronome with a purple light, and dogs will start drooling for any old purple light, despite the fact they've never had meat show up when the purple light was present, right? That was the idea of higher order conditioning. We saw an example of Coca-Cola using higher order conditioning to sort of successfully build their branding by hijacking some existing good associations about Christmas. And at the time, I pointed out something really important. Every step of the chain in higher order conditioning makes the connection a little weaker, meaning that Pavlov's dogs might end up drooling to a purple light, but not as much as they drool to the metronome, and certainly not as much as they drool to the meat itself. And if we then pair the purple light with a triangle shape, yeah, they may eventually start drooling a bit to the triangle shape, but not very much, right? So you might think, okay, this is a limitation on the power of companies to influence us with respondent conditioning, right? Coca-Cola might steal the associative power of people's good feelings about Christmas, but that's weaker than the initial positive feelings of Christmas itself, you know? Except the fact that higher order conditioning weakens as you go up could also be used to weaken our defenses. And that's precisely what some mobile game app designers have perfected. So if you're not familiar with the term freemium, like freemium games, there's a nice South Park episode explaining the basic idea, but it comes from free plus premium, meaning it's an app or a game that looks like it's free. It doesn't cost anything to download and use, but includes a bunch of in-app purchases as their way of getting users money. So this excerpt from a Vox video kind of explains the idea.
First thing these games do is set up a virtual currency so that it doesn't feel like you're spending real currency, even though you are. This is a variation on something we've known for decades, which is that people find it harder to spend money when they're paying in cash than if they're using a card.
So when you pay cash for something, you see it leave your hands, and you get a very immediate sense of like how much your cash reserves have dropped, how much your wealth has dropped.
Games add yet another layer. You pay for lollipop boosters with gold bars, and you pay for gold bars with your credit card, which is already distanced from the actual payment. And then on top of that, they don't make the exchange rate simple. It's not 50 gems for 50 cents.
There's always something weird, like $1 will get you 12 purple diamonds. And that sort of off-kilter exchange rate is the same thing you see with people spending, tourists spending money that they're not familiar with in foreign countries.
If incense costs 80 Poke Coins and a batch of 550 Poke Coins costs $4.99, how much real money does incense cost? Yeah, I don't know either. So you're spending money that doesn't seem real, and it only takes a second because the App Store already has your credit card. The whole payment process is designed to be painless. Other parts of the game, however, are designed to be painful. A key finding of behavioral research is that people tend to experience unexpected losses more intensely than comparable gains. That can inform the timing of purchase prompts. In Puzzle & Dragons, players progress through a dungeon before facing a boss, and if they die, they stand to lose all the rewards that they just earned. That's when they're presented with the option to save their coins and their points by spending magic stones, which you can buy in the store with real money. Other developers actively embed inconvenience into the games so that you can purchase convenience. In Clash of Clans and Game of War, everything you try to build has wait times that get progressively longer but are skippable for a price.
So they build incentives to sort of remove pain points into the games, and then if they want that, then they have the incentive to insert pain points into the game.
So think of this in terms of higher order respondent conditioning. If spending actual money just to remove a tiny barrier in the game is going to be painful, then spending credit card money to do so is a little less painful. And spending game currency is even less painful. And spending jewels or donuts that get you the game currency or other arbitrary game units is even less painful. This works because each step of higher order classical conditioning is weaker. Our brain doesn't keep up with the conversion, and we don't feel the pain of spending $15 on, in-game jewels or something like that, the same as we would spending $15 worth of cash. Now, let's play this little, I don't know. Well, let's put it this way. You might be thinking, I don't usually pay money for these apps, right? I just download a mobile game for something mindless to do when I'm relaxing or watching TV or waiting for my food to finish. Cool. But even if that's true, even if you don't spend a lot on in-app purchases, your behavior is still being influenced indirectly because of the influencing they're doing to control the people who do pay. So let's see a quick little example of that.
Ultimately, though, only a tiny percentage of players actually become payers. And a small percentage of payers are those so-called whales, people who will spend hundreds, sometimes thousands of dollars in the app. The marketing firm Swerve estimates that about half of the revenue for mobile games is coming from less than 0.5% of all players. Which means that for some of these games, non-paying users, which is most people, are essentially pouring time into a game designed to hit the pain points of a small, susceptible group of players.
So they literally design the games to be less fun, to be less game-like and enjoyable, and more slot machine-like. And they build in annoying delays and waits and threats of loss, sometimes through unfair scenarios that really kind of screw you over if you haven't paid, specifically because they've run tests to find the ideal way to manipulate user behavior. The same way Skinner ran tests on the rats or the pigeons in his Skinner box to figure out what changes will change the behavior. And that may be aiming at the whales who spend a lot of money, yeah, but they still get plenty of money from the non-whales. And even those who never pay a dime are paying a boatload, you might even say a whale load, of their own free time on something deliberately designed to be kind of bad and annoying. So yeah, the big spenders are these whales, and we can argue over whether the person who spends $10,000 on microtransactions might actually qualify as addicted, right? Whether this is just a type of gambling disorder like in the DSM-5. But despite the fact that most purchases in these games are small, so you can see from the leftmost bar here, where the green part is purchases under $10, the majority of revenue, the majority of the money they get in these games comes from a smaller number of big purchases greater than $20. But the designers, they really do build in pain points on purpose to take away the fun of their quote-unquote games and add in design elements that have been shown time and time again to manipulate the behavior of users to get more money. So the blog essay that I'm kind of mentioning here at the top, that's from 2013. It lists a lot of the sketchy behavioral tricks and theories that freemium games use to coercively monetize their games. The designers have a bunch of terms for all these tricks, like progress gates and reward removal and soft and hard boosts and fun pain and stuff we saw like premium currencies. Indeed, these companies are now using AI and machine learning to analyze every little keystroke and mouse movement and touch and scroll, everything you do down to the millisecond, both for games and for social media and all your other apps. They know exactly how many fractions of a second something was on your screen, how long you paused after scrolling past something before you scrolled back up to glance at it, right? If you just skipped over it too quickly, how likely you are to play one more level of the game if they change the enemy hit points to be 24 instead of 23. They use these machine learning algorithms to predict and control your behavior, to get you, yes, and the whales, to spend more time in their game or in their app. And then some of you and the whales will make in-app purchases and microtransactions, or will just spend more time watching and hearing ads. Anyway, I'll end this first video here, but in the next video, I'm going to get a little more into the broad psychology of tech-related behaviors, first by talking about dopamine, and then some of the sort of social implications and some tips to defend yourself.